There is a moment in early Scandinavian history that honestly sounds like pure fantasy. Warriors believed that if you forged a sword using the bones of your enemies, the spirit of that enemy would enter the blade, not metaphorically, literally. The idea was brutally simple. Kill a man, burn or grind his bones, add them into the forge while shaping your weapon, and somehow his strength, his soul, his power would live inside the sword you carried into battle. At first glance, it sounds exactly like the kind of myth people in the Iron Age might believe. Superstitious warriors trying to give meaning to violence. Except here is where the story becomes strange, because those swords actually did become stronger. And for a very long time, historians assumed the whole thing was symbolic. A ritual, a warrior myth, maybe a psychological trick that made fighters feel more powerful. But when modern researchers finally began studying surviving blades from this era, they discovered something that completely flipped the story on its head. The Vikings were not putting souls into their swords. They were accidentally making steel. And honestly, bro, moments like this are exactly why I love digging into history. Because sometimes the truth hiding behind a myth is even crazier than the myth itself. If stories like that are your thing, you're going to like this channel. So, to understand what was really happening, we need to rewind a little bit. Long before the Viking raids that everyone knows about, before the longships and legendary warriors, Scandinavia had a serious problem. Their weapons were terrible. Not because their blacksmiths lacked skill, but because of the material they were forced to work with. Most iron in early Scandinavia did not come from deep mines like in other parts of Europe. Instead, it came from something called bog iron, and bog iron is exactly what it sounds like, iron that forms inside wetlands. In these bogs, bacteria slowly oxidize tiny traces of iron dissolved in the water. Over time, that process concentrates the metal into deposits that people can dig up and smelt, which, by the way, is fascinating to me because I genuinely had no idea there was basically an organic way to farm iron from a swamp. But for the people trying to turn that iron into weapons, it was a nightmare. Bog iron is full of impurities. When it is forged into a blade, the metal ends up soft. Too soft. Imagine going into battle with a sword that bends easily, dulls quickly, or fails under pressure while your enemy's weapon holds its edge. That is not a minor inconvenience. That is the difference between winning a fight and not walking away from it at all. And the Scandinavians were certainly no strangers to fighting. So eventually, blacksmiths started experimenting. And this is where the story takes the turn that sounds like mythology. At some point, they began adding bones into the forging process. Sometimes the bones of enemies killed in battle. Sometimes animal bones. The belief behind this practice was deeply spiritual. Warriors thought the essence of the dead person would fuse with the weapon. A stronger enemy meant a stronger spirit. A stronger spirit meant a stronger blade. From their perspective, they were literally creating soul-bound weapons. For centuries, historians assumed this practice was nothing more than superstition. But the Vikings themselves were convinced it worked, because swords forged this way seemed tougher and more durable. And when modern scientists finally analyzed the metal composition of these blades, they discovered why. Bones contain carbon. Like all organic material, bones carry carbon within their structure. And carbon is exactly the element needed to transform iron into steel. So when Viking smiths threw bones into the forge, the carbon from those bones was being absorbed into the metal during the forging process. The bog iron was slowly turning into a crude form of steel. In other words, these warriors believed they were infusing their swords with spirits, but what they were actually doing was improving their metallurgy. I have to admit, bro, that realization is one of my favorite moments in historical research, because you can almost picture the moment modern historians made the connection. Someone looking at the blade thinking, that's cute, they added bones because they believed in soul magic. And then the analysis comes back and suddenly it is like, wait a second, there is no soul inside this sword, but there is carbon. And that carbon turned the iron into early steel, which means that one of the earliest improvements in European weapon technology may have come from warriors trying to trap the souls of their enemies inside a blade. And that is exactly the kind of story that reminds you why history can be so fascinating. Because sometimes myths are not wrong, they are just misunderstood. And the Viking soul sword is only the beginning, because the next story might be even stranger. For centuries, people believed one of the most famous scenes associated with the Roman Colosseum never actually happened: gladiators fighting lions. It turns out that might not be a myth either. For a long time, one of the most iconic images of ancient Rome was treated as pure exaggeration. You've probably seen it in movies, paintings, documentaries: a gladiator standing in the Colosseum, shield raised, staring down a massive lion or tiger. It's one of those scenes that feels so dramatic it almost has to be fictional. And for a very long time, historians actually thought it was. The Roman Colosseum hosted an enormous variety of spectacles. Gladiators fought other gladiators, criminals were forced to fight each other, and sometimes condemned prisoners were thrown into the arena against professional fighters. There were even naval battles staged inside the arena when the Romans flooded it with water and floated ships inside. That part alone still blows my mind a little. Imagine an entire stadium being turned into a temporary sea battle just to entertain a crowd. The Romans were operating on a completely different level of spectacle. But when it came to the specific image of gladiators fighting large predators like lions or tigers, the situation was strangely unclear. Ancient artwork clearly depicted those fights. Mosaics, carvings, and paintings showed men facing enormous cats in the arena. Yet for centuries, historians couldn't find physical proof that these encounters actually happened. And because of that, a theory started to take hold. Maybe those images were symbolic. Maybe they were just meant to represent bravery or strength. Maybe they were exaggerated stories, meant to make the game seem even more heroic than they already were. And honestly, that explanation made sense for a long time. Just because something appears in ancient art doesn't mean it reflects a real event. Humans have always loved dramatic imagery. A gladiator defeating a lion is about as dramatic as it gets. But then, something changed. In recent years, archaeologists revisited skeletal remains found near the Colosseum. Some of these bones had actually been discovered in the early 2000s, but only recently were they studied in enough detail to reveal something important. In 2025, researchers published an analysis of a skeleton believed to belong to a young man, probably around 20 years old, who died during the Roman Games. And what they found on that skeleton was unmistakable. Deep bite marks. Not small ones. Not the kind left by another human. These were large punctures, carved into the skull and pelvis. Marks that matched the teeth pattern of a big cat, most likely a lion or tiger. When archaeologists compared the spacing and depth of the wounds, the conclusion became very difficult to avoid. This man had been attacked by a large predator, and the location of the remains connected the event directly to the Colosseum, which means that for centuries, people assumed those dramatic depictions of gladiators facing giant beasts were just artistic symbolism. But now we have physical evidence suggesting that those fights really did happen. And the thing that makes this discovery so fascinating to me is how close historians were to dismissing it completely. The artwork was always there. The stories were always there. But without physical evidence, the idea was treated as exaggeration. Then suddenly, a single skeleton shows up, with the wrong kind of bite marks, and the entire narrative shifts. Because when you think about it, the Romans were already doing things inside the Colosseum that sound completely insane by modern standards. They staged naval battles. They organized executions as public entertainment. They engineered elaborate hunting spectacles, known as venaciones, where exotic animals were brought from across the empire to be displayed and killed in the arena. So once you start remembering all of that, the idea that a gladiator might face a lion in front of 80,000 screaming spectators suddenly doesn't sound impossible at all. And I'll be honest, bro, that realization hits a little differently when you picture it clearly. A man standing in the center of the arena sand, the gates open, a massive predator steps out, the crowd erupts. This wasn't mythology. This was entertainment, which means that one of the most dramatic images associated with ancient Rome may have been dismissed as exaggeration for centuries, when in reality, it was just another day in the Colosseum. But if that story feels strange, the next one might be even stranger, because for hundreds of years, people in Europe believed that one of the largest animals on Earth was completely fictional. They thought gorillas were mythological creatures. For hundreds of years, people in Europe believed that gorillas were basically mythical creatures. And I know that sounds ridiculous today, because now we can watch gorillas in documentaries, in zoos, even in viral videos online. But if you go back a few centuries, the idea of a giant, muscular, human-like ape living deep in the forests of Africa sounded less like biology and more like folklore. And the strange thing is that people had actually described these animals long before science confirmed they existed. One of the earliest recorded descriptions came from an English traveler named Andrew Battelle, who lived between the late 1500s and early 1600s. During his travels in West Africa, he wrote about encountering a creature that local people called the pongo. His description is fascinating because when you read it today, it is very obviously a gorilla. He described a creature that looked like a man but larger, with a human-like face, deep-set eyes, long hair on its body, and enormous strength. According to Battelle, these creatures walked partly upright, moved in groups, and were so powerful that several men could not easily capture one alive. Now, reading that description today, it is almost impossible not to recognize what he was talking about. But back then, Europeans had no reference point for an animal like that. To them, it sounded like the kind of creature you would expect to hear about in a sailor's tale after too much rum. So the story was mostly dismissed. Some people assumed Battelle had exaggerated. Others thought he had misunderstood what he saw. And some simply assumed he had invented the story entirely. And then something strange happened. Nothing. For more than 200 years, there was no clear confirmation of the animal Battelle described. 2 centuries is a long time for a story to sit in the gray area between rumor and reality. So eventually, the idea of giant human-like apes living in Africa settled into the category of legend. Then, in the 1800s, things began to change. A physician and naturalist named Thomas Savage obtained several large ape skulls and bones from West Africa. When he studied these remains, he realized they belonged to a species that had never been formally described by Western science. Savage eventually published a scientific description of this animal and gave it the name we now know, gorilla. But even then, the story was not fully settled, because bones are one thing and seeing the living animal is another. That confirmation came later through explorers such as Paul du Chaillu, a French-American traveler who spent time in Central Africa collecting animal specimens. Du Chaillu didn't just find bones. He encountered the animals themselves and sent gorilla bodies back to museums in Europe. And that was the moment the myth collapsed. Because suddenly, the legendary ape, described for centuries, was standing right in front of European scientists. Massive shoulders, enormous arms, human-like eyes staring back at them from behind thick black fur. And here is the detail that always makes me laugh a little. The Western world officially confirmed the existence of gorillas in the mid-1800s. But dinosaurs had already been scientifically identified decades earlier. Think about that for a second. Humans figured out the existence of animals that lived millions of years ago before confirming a creature that was literally still walking around on Earth at the time. And honestly, bro, that detail always makes this story feel slightly absurd in the best possible way. Because it shows how easy it is for real things to be dismissed when they don't fit the expectations of the people hearing about them. The local populations in Africa obviously knew gorillas existed. They lived alongside them, but because European explorers couldn't initially confirm it themselves, the stories were treated as myths until someone finally brought the evidence home. And once that happened, the mythical creature suddenly became one of the most recognizable animals on the planet. But even that story might not be the strangest example of myth slowly turning into reality, because sometimes myths don't just come from misidentified animals. Sometimes they come from very real practices that slowly transform into legend. And one of the most famous examples of that might come from Greek mythology itself, the story of the Golden Fleece. Greek mythology is filled with stories that sound so grand and supernatural that it's easy to assume none of it has any connection to reality. Gods throwing lightning bolts, monsters guarding treasures, heroes sailing across impossible seas. It all feels like pure imagination. But every once in a while, you run into a detail inside those myths that feels a little too specific to be completely invented. And one of the best examples of that might be the famous story of the Golden Fleece. According to the myth, the Golden Fleece was the hide of a magical flying ram with golden wool. It was said to possess divine power and symbolize kingship and authority. The hero Jason, leader of the Argonauts, set out on an epic journey to retrieve it from a distant land called Colchis. The story is dramatic. Jason faces impossible obstacles, navigates political intrigue, and eventually steals the fleece after overcoming a dragon that guarded it. Classic mythology stuff. Gods, monsters, heroic quests. You know the drill. But if you strip away the magical parts for a second, there is one detail in that story that has always been strangely grounded: the location. In the myth, the Golden Fleece is located in Colchis, which corresponds to a real region on the eastern coast of the Black Sea in what is now modern-day Georgia. That geographical detail has always caught the attention of historians, because when ancient stories mention a real place, sometimes it means the myth was built around something that actually existed there. And in this case, there is a very interesting practice that has been documented in that exact region for centuries. In the mountain rivers of Georgia, small particles of gold naturally wash downstream from mineral deposits higher in the mountains. These particles are too tiny to easily collect by hand, but people discovered a clever method thousands of years ago. They would place sheepskins in the riverbeds, letting the flowing water carry gold particles into the wool. Over time, the dense fibers of the fleece would trap the gold. When the skins were removed and dried, the wool would be filled with glittering gold flakes. A literal golden fleece. And the fascinating part is that variations of this technique are still used in parts of that region today, which means it's very possible that this method has been around for thousands of years. So imagine you are a traveler or storyteller in the ancient world, and you see something like that for the first time. A sheep's pelt hanging to dry, sparkling with gold. It wouldn't take much imagination for that image to evolve into something legendary. Suddenly, it's not just a clever mining technique. It becomes the hide of a divine animal, a treasure guarded by monsters, a prize worthy of a hero's quest. And honestly, I love that kind of transformation, because it shows how myths don't always appear out of nowhere. Sometimes they start with a very real image that captures people's attention. A strange sight, a powerful symbol. Then over generations, storytelling adds layers of drama and meaning until the original detail is buried under centuries of legend. But once you dig deep enough, the real thing is still there. And if that example shows how everyday practices can slowly become mythological, the final story in this video goes in the opposite direction. Because sometimes, a terrifying creature described in ancient legends turns out to be something that actually existed. Something big, something powerful, and something that could probably kill a human. The Maori people of New Zealand told stories for generations about a monstrous bird called the puakai. According to their legends, this creature was so large and so strong that it could snatch a person from the ground and carry them away. For centuries, that story sounded like exactly what you would expect from oral folklore, until scientists discovered the bones of something that made those stories a lot harder to dismiss. For generations, the Maori people of New Zealand told stories about a terrifying creature known as the puakai. According to these stories, it was a massive bird of prey, powerful enough to lift a human from the ground and kill them. In the legends, it appears almost like a monster from a nightmare, a shadow in the sky, a warning passed down through stories told to children and warriors alike. Naturally, when Europeans first encountered these accounts, they assumed the same thing historians often assume about oral traditions: that the creature was symbolic, a myth, a story meant to exaggerate danger in the wilderness. And to be fair, if someone told you about a giant eagle capable of attacking people, you might assume the same thing. It sounds like the kind of creature that belongs in fantasy rather than reality. But here's where things get interesting. In the 19th century, researchers studying the prehistoric wildlife of New Zealand began uncovering the remains of a bird that did not exist anywhere else on Earth, a bird now known as the Haast's eagle. And this thing was enormous. The Haast's eagle is believed to be the largest eagle species that has ever lived. Estimates suggest it weighed between 10 and 18 kilograms, with a wingspan approaching 3 meters. But what made it truly terrifying was not just its size. It was its hunting style. This eagle evolved in an ecosystem where the largest prey animals were giant flightless birds known as moa, some of which weighed over 200 kilograms. The eagle's body became larger and more powerful over generations, so it could attack and kill these massive animals. which means this was not a bird that hunted small rabbits or fish. This was a predator capable of delivering crushing strikes with enormous talons, diving from the sky with incredible force. Now imagine you are one of the first Maori settlers arriving in New Zealand centuries ago. You enter a new land filled with unfamiliar wildlife, and somewhere above you, a bird large enough to hunt animals, weighing several hundred pounds, is circling. It doesn't take much imagination to understand how a creature like that could become the center of legend. And here's the detail that really ties the story together. Scientists believe that the Haast's eagle went extinct sometime around the 15th century, not long after the arrival of the Maori people. The reason appears to be ecological collapse. The Maori hunted the moa to extinction, which removed the primary food source for the eagle. Without the moa, the giant predator could no longer survive. But for a brief period, humans and this enormous bird lived in the same environment. Which means the stories of the Puakai may not have been exaggerations at all. They may have been memories, cultural echoes of encounters with a predator that no longer exists. And honestly, bro, that possibility is one of my favorite things about studying old myths. Because once in a while, a legend that sounds completely impossible turns out to be a distorted memory of something real. A sword forged with bones that accidentally became steel. Gladiators facing lions in the arena. A giant ape dismissed as fantasy for 2 centuries. A sheepskin sparkling with gold that became the golden fleece. A monstrous bird that once ruled the skies over New Zealand. Over and over again, history shows us the same pattern. Myths are not always lies. Sometimes they are just stories that lost their context over time. Sometimes they are real events, remembered imperfectly, passed down through generations until they start sounding unbelievable. And when you look closely enough, you occasionally discover that the truth hiding underneath the myth is even more interesting than the myth itself. If you enjoy stories where history turns out to be stranger than fiction, that's exactly what we explore here on Everything But the Kitchen Sink. And if this kind of hidden history story surprised you, stick around, because there are a lot more myths out there that might not be myths at all.